September 15th, 1950. The telegram arrived at Kim Il-sung's headquarters in Pyongyang at 4:47 a.m., delivered by a breathless courier who had driven through the night from the Southern Front. The 38-year-old leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was already awake, sitting at his desk reviewing reports of the previous day's fighting around the Pusan perimeter, where his Korean People's Army had been grinding against stubborn American and South Korean resistance for weeks. He opened the telegram with steady hands, but as he read the first line, his face went pale. Urgent, large-scale American amphibious landing at Inchon. Estimated 2 divisions. Naval bombardment ongoing. Our forces retreating. Kim Il-sung read it again, then a third time. Then he stood abruptly, knocking over his chair, and shouted for his chief of staff. Within minutes, the command room was filled with senior officers of the Korean People's Army, all of them trying to make sense of fragmentary reports coming in from the West Coast. General Cho Yong-gon, Minister of Defense, spread a map across the table, his finger stabbing at the port city of Inchon, just 20 miles from Seoul. "How many troops?" Kim Il-sung demanded. "We don't know exactly," Cho admitted. "Initial reports say at least 40,000, possibly more. Marines. They landed at high tide. Our coastal defenses were inadequate." "Inadequate," Kim Il-sung's voice rose. "We had units stationed there. We had artillery. How did they—" "The naval bombardment destroyed most of our positions before the landing," interrupted General Kim Chek, commander of the frontline forces. "American battleships, cruisers, aircraft. They pounded our defenses for hours, and the landing itself—" He paused, struggling to find words. "Comrade Premier, they landed with tanks, with artillery, with trucks and supplies. They came ashore in waves, hundreds of landing craft, covered by aircraft and naval guns. Our troops couldn't stop them." Kim Il-sung stared at the map, his mind racing. For 3 months, his army had been winning. They had pushed the South Koreans and their American allies down the peninsula, had captured Seoul, had driven them into a tiny perimeter around Pusan. Victory had seemed certain. Just one more push, and the entire peninsula would be unified under his leadership. And now this. "Where exactly did they land?" he asked, his voice calmer now, controlled. Choe pointed to the map. "Here, at Inchon. It's a terrible place for an amphibious landing. The tides are extreme, the approaches are narrow, the sea walls are high. That's why we didn't expect it. That's why our defenses were light. But they did it anyway," Kim Il-sung said flatly. "Yes, Comrade Premier, and now they're moving inland. If they take Seoul, our entire army at Pusan is cut off," Kim Il-sung finished. He sat down heavily, the weight of the strategic disaster suddenly clear. His army, the bulk of his forces, was at the southern tip of the peninsula, hundreds of miles from Pyongyang. Their supply lines ran down the peninsula's spine, through Seoul. If the Americans captured Seoul, those supply lines would be severed. His army would be trapped. "We need to pull back," said General Kang Kon, commander of the Second Corps. "Immediately. Withdraw from Pusan before we're surrounded." "Pull back?" Kim Chek said angrily. "We're on the verge of victory at Pusan. 1 more week, maybe 2, and we'll break through. If we withdraw now—" "If we don't withdraw now, we'll lose the entire army," Kang interrupted. "Don't you understand? The Americans didn't land at Inchon by accident. This is MacArthur. He's trying to cut us off, to trap us in the south. We need to retreat while we still can." Kim Il-sung held up his hand for silence. His mind was working through the options, none of them good. Retreat from Pusan meant abandoning the dream of quick victory, meant giving up all the territory they had conquered, but staying meant risking encirclement and destruction. "How long before the Americans reach Seoul?" he asked. Choe consulted his notes. "Our intelligence estimates 3 to 5 days. We have some units in Seoul, but they're rear echelon troops, not combat formations. They won't be able to hold for long." And how long to withdraw our forces from Busan? At least a week, maybe longer. The roads are clogged with supplies, with wounded, and the Americans will pursue us. It won't be an orderly withdrawal. It will be a fighting retreat. Kim Il-sung closed his eyes. In 3 months, he had gone from certain victory to potential catastrophe, and all because of one bold American stroke. Who planned this? He asked quietly. Which American general? MacArthur, Cho said. Douglas MacArthur. He commands all UN forces in Korea. Kim Il-sung nodded slowly. He knew of MacArthur. Everyone in Asia knew of MacArthur. The American general who had island-hopped across the Pacific, who had accepted Japan's surrender, who had ruled Japan like a proconsul for 5 years, a man with a reputation for brilliance and arrogance in equal measure. He's a gambler, Kim Il-sung said. Inchon was a gamble. The tides, the defenses. A more cautious commander would never have tried it, but it worked. He opened his eyes and looked at his generals. And now we're paying the price for underestimating him. Across the room, Soviet military advisor Colonel Ivan Vasilyev stood quietly, observing the Korean commander's panic with growing concern. Vasilyev was one of dozens of Soviet advisors attached to the Korean People's Army, providing tactical guidance and liaison with Moscow. He had watched the North Korean offensive with professional interest, noting both the successes and the weaknesses. And now, watching the response to the Inchon landing, he was seeing those weaknesses in sharp relief. "Comrade Premier," he said in accented Korean, "may I speak?" Kim Il-sung gestured for him to continue. "This landing at Inchon is a serious blow, but it is not necessarily fatal. The Americans have committed significant forces to the landing, which means they've weakened their defenses at Busan. If you strike hard at Busan now, you might break through before you have to withdraw." Kim Chek seized on this. "Yes, one final offensive. We throw everything at Busan, break through, and then..." "And then what?" Kang interrupted. "Even if we break through, the Americans will still be at Seoul, cutting our supply lines. We'll have won a tactical victory, but lost strategically." Vasilyev nodded reluctantly. General Kang is correct. The strategic situation has changed fundamentally. Comrade Stalin's guidance has always been that you should not risk your army in a battle you cannot win. Right now, the priority must be preserving your forces. "Preserving," Kim Il-sung said bitterly. "You mean retreating, running away?" "I mean," Vasilyev said carefully, "conducting a strategic withdrawal to defensible positions, regrouping and preparing for the next phase of the war. The Americans have surprised you. That doesn't mean they've defeated you. But you need to adapt." Kim Il-sung stood and walked to the window. Outside, Pyongyang was still dark, the city not yet aware that everything had changed. He thought about the promises he had made to his people, to Stalin, to himself. He had promised to unify Korea, to liberate the South from American imperialism. And for 3 months it had seemed so close. "Contact our forces at Busan," he said finally. "Order them to begin withdrawing. Fighting withdrawal. They should delay the Americans as much as possible but not get trapped, and send every available unit to Seoul. We need to hold Seoul long enough for our main forces to escape the trap." "And if we can't hold Seoul?" Choe asked. Kim Il-sung turned to face him. "Then we lose Seoul. We've lost it before. We took it back. We can take it again. But if we lose the army, we lose everything." In Seoul, 120 miles south of Pyongyang, the situation was chaotic. The city had been under North Korean occupation since June, and the occupation forces, mostly rear echelon troops, political officers, and security personnel, were completely unprepared for the American landing at Inchon. Lieutenant General Lee Kwon-moo, the North Korean commander in Seoul, received word of the Inchon landing at 5:30 a.m. His first reaction was disbelief. Inchon? Impossible. The tides alone made it impossible. It had to be a feint, a diversion from the real landing elsewhere. But as reports continued to pour in, American Marines in the streets of Inchon, American tanks moving inland, American aircraft dominating the skies, disbelief turned to panic. "How many troops do we have in Seoul?" he demanded of his staff. "About 10,000, sir, but most are administrative personnel, not combat troops. We have some artillery, some anti-aircraft guns, but we're not prepared to defend the city," Lee finished. He looked at the map, calculating distances and time. The Americans were 20 miles away. With armored vehicles and air support, they could be in Seoul by tomorrow, maybe the day after. "Start evacuating non-essential personnel," he ordered, "and prepare defensive positions at key points, the bridges over the Han River, the main roads into the city. We need to delay them as long as possible." "Sir," one of his officers said hesitantly, "we've received orders from Pyongyang. We're to hold Seoul at all costs." Lee looked at the young officer with something like pity. At all costs, with 10,000 rear echelon troops against 2 American divisions with tanks and air support, tell Pyongyang that we'll do our best, but they should prepare for us to lose the city. Over the next 2 days, as American forces advanced from Inchon, Lee's troops fought a series of delaying actions. They blew bridges, set up roadblocks, fired from buildings, and then retreated. It was brave, but ultimately futile. The Americans had overwhelming firepower, tanks, artillery, aircraft, naval guns firing from offshore. Every time the North Koreans tried to make a stand, they were pounded into submission. On September 22nd, 1 week after the Inchon landing, American Marines entered Seoul. Lee and the remnants of his forces retreated north across the Han River, blowing the bridges behind them. Seoul had fallen. In Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung received the news in silence. He had expected it, had known it was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier. Seoul, the ancient capital of Korea, the symbolic heart of the peninsula, was back in American hands. "Our forces from Busan?" he asked. "Withdrawing," Cho reported. "But it's chaos. The Americans are pursuing aggressively. We're losing equipment, losing stragglers, and morale is collapsing. The soldiers don't understand why we're retreating when we were winning." Kim Il-sung rubbed his face, suddenly looking much older than his 38 years. In 2 weeks, his triumphant offensive had turned into a desperate retreat. Thousands of his soldiers were dead or captured. Equipment was abandoned along the roads. The dream of quick unification was shattered. "What does Moscow say?" he asked Vasiliev. The Soviet advisor looked uncomfortable. "Comrade Stalin is concerned. He believes the situation can still be salvaged, but he questions some of the strategic decisions that were made." "Meaning he blames me?" Kim Il-sung said flatly. Vasiliev didn't answer, which was answer enough. "Tell Comrade Stalin," Kim Il-sung said, his voice hard, "that I didn't lose this war because of bad strategy. I lost it because I underestimated American capabilities. I thought MacArthur was cautious, conventional. I thought an amphibious landing at Inchon was impossible. I was wrong." He stood and walked to the map, tracing the American advance with his finger. "MacArthur is brilliant, I'll give him that. He saw an opportunity that no one else saw, and he had the courage to take it. But this war isn't over. We still have an army. We still have Soviet support, and we still have Chinese support, or we will if the Americans push too far north." "You think the Chinese will intervene?" Choa asked. "I think," Kim Il-sung said carefully, "that Chairman Mao will not allow American forces on China's border. If MacArthur keeps advancing north, if he pushes toward the Yalu River, the Chinese will have no choice but to intervene. And when they do, everything changes." Vasiliev nodded slowly. "That is also Comrade Stalin's assessment, but it depends on MacArthur. If he stops at the 38th parallel, declares victory, and consolidates—" "He won't," Kim Il-sung interrupted. "I've been studying him, reading about his campaigns in the Pacific. He's not a man who stops at half measures. He'll want complete victory. He'll want to destroy my army, occupy all of North Korea, maybe even threaten China. His ego won't let him settle for anything less. Then you're counting on American arrogance to save you, Kang said. I'm counting on MacArthur's arrogance to bring the Chinese into the war, Kim Il-sung corrected. And once the Chinese are in, the Americans will face a very different situation. In the weeks that followed, Kim Il-sung's prediction proved accurate. American and South Korean forces pursued the retreating North Korean army up the peninsula, recapturing territory and pushing toward the Chinese border. MacArthur, emboldened by his success at Inchon, advocated for complete victory, the destruction of North Korea and the unification of the peninsula under South Korean leadership. In Pyongyang, as American forces approached, Kim Il-sung and his government prepared to evacuate to the Chinese border. The capital that had seemed so secure in August was now threatened. The army that had seemed invincible was shattered and demoralized. On October 19, 1950, Chinese forces began crossing the Yalu River into North Korea. The intervention that Kim Il-sung had counted on was beginning. The war that MacArthur thought he had won was about to enter a new and bloodier phase. But even as Chinese troops poured into Korea, Kim Il-sung understood that something fundamental had changed. The Inchon landing had revealed the limits of his own military capability and the extent of American power. He had started the war believing that the Americans were weak, that they would not fight for Korea, that victory would be quick and easy. Inchon had shattered those illusions. Years later, in conversations with Soviet and Chinese allies, Kim Il-sung would reflect on the Inchon landing with a mixture of respect and bitterness. MacArthur was a genius, he would say. An arrogant, reckless genius, but a genius nonetheless. In one stroke, he turned certain defeat into victory. If he had been more cautious, more conventional, we would have won. But he wasn't, and that changed everything. What North Korean leaders said when American forces landed at Inchon can be summed up in a few stark admissions, spoken in different ways by different men, but all expressing the same fundamental shock. We underestimated them. Kim Il-sung said it explicitly to his Soviet advisors. I thought the Americans were soft, that they wouldn't fight. I was wrong. This changes everything. General Cho Yong-gon said it when the first reports came in. If they take Seoul, our entire strategy collapses. We were winning, and now we're losing. Ordinary soldiers said it as they retreated north, abandoning equipment and territory. How did this happen? We were winning. MacArthur is more dangerous than we thought. Kim Il-sung's grudging respect for his opponent. He's a gambler, but he's a brilliant gambler. We need Chinese help. The unspoken admission that North Korea alone could not defeat the Americans. If the Chinese don't intervene, we're finished. The Inchon landing was a strategic masterstroke that transformed the Korean War. In one bold operation, MacArthur turned a desperate defensive situation into an offensive triumph, cut off the North Korean army, and recaptured Seoul. It was one of the most successful amphibious operations in military history, but it was also the beginning of a much longer and bloodier conflict. MacArthur's success at Inchon led him to overreach, to push too far north, to underestimate the Chinese, just as Kim Il-sung had underestimated the Americans. And that overreach would lead to Chinese intervention, a massive American retreat, and 3 more years of brutal warfare that would end in stalemate. For Kim Il-sung, the Inchon landing was a harsh education in the realities of modern warfare. He had started the war with confidence, even arrogance, believing that the Americans were weak and that victory would be swift. Inchon taught him that the Americans were neither weak nor predictable, that they were capable of bold strokes and devastating firepower. It was a lesson he never forgot. For the rest of his life, Kim Il-sung would maintain a massive military, would fortify North Korea against invasion, would develop nuclear weapons to deter American attack. The paranoia, the militarism, the isolation, all of it can be traced back to September 15th, 1950, when American Marines landed at Inchon and shattered his dream of quick unification. In the command room in Pyongyang, watching his offensive collapse and his army retreat, Kim Il-sung learned that wars are not won by ideology or enthusiasm alone. They are won by strategy, by logistics, by technology, by the ability to surprise and adapt. And on that September morning, Douglas MacArthur had surprised him completely. "We were not ready," Kim Il-sung would later admit to his inner circle. "We thought we were, but we weren't, and MacArthur made us pay for that mistake." It was perhaps the most honest thing he ever said about the war.